Hey everybody, welcome to Mammoth Interactive's YouTube channel. First of all, I want to thank you for watching this video. And remember that this channel doesn't do Patreon. Instead, we sell our digital courses down below. And every single dollar that we get from the products you buy below goes into making more content. The best way to help out this channel and Mammoth Interactive is to subscribe to Mammoth Interactive's huge library of content. Get thousands of hours and hundreds of courses for a low price down below. We have a monthly option and a yearly option. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the video.
Hello everyone, and welcome to a tutorial on guessing HTML elements by their ID. Here we're going to learn the first way of a few to fetch HTML elements. This will be by their ID, and we're going to do this with JavaScript. So let's head on over to JSBin. And here we have just a blank HTML page started. We've got the classic CSS starting text. We've got our JavaScript window open, and we're not really too worried about the output for now. So there's lots of different ways we can fetch HTML elements, and we can do so using JavaScript, and there's lots of reasons why we would want to do this. So let's say that we have maybe a div or some container, and at some point in time we want to change its color. So that means that it will start out with one color and then turn a different color later on. Well, we'll probably use JavaScript to do that. Okay, so there'll be some kind of a trigger, something that would make it change color. But to do so through JavaScript, the first thing we'll have to do would be to fetch that HTML element so that we can change its properties. So to help us to demonstrate how to do this, we're just going to first create a div. It doesn't really matter what we put in this div. I mean, it could be blank. I'm just going to put in some text here. It's called mine Mammoth Interactive. And I'm going to give this div an ID. Let's give it the ID of just div1. Okay, pretty boring, but that's okay. And I'm not too worried about the style for now. Actually, you know what? I'm going to change the margin to 20 pixels just to kind of bring it away from the page, from the corner of the page. And that's it for the CSS, so we can go ahead and close that. Okay, so I'm interested in only my JavaScript and HTML for now. The first thing I want to do is get this element by its ID. So there's actually a built-in function to help us to do this. It's called getElement by ID, just like this. Okay, so we actually call this on the document. So we call document.getElement by ID, and this is a function call. So what this function is going to do is it's going to take in an ID as a string. It's going to look through my HTML document. It's going to find the first HTML element with the ID, and then it's going to return it. So in this case, I'm interested in the ID div1. And because it's going to return something, I can store this in a variable. So let's call this div1 equal to document. So if you don't know, JavaScript variables are just a way to store a value. So there's lots of different types of variables. We could have strings, which look a little like this. We could have various number variables. We could have true or false variables. In this case, this variable is a div. This is the entire div here, and it contains this text. It contains any styling information, such as how big it is, what position it is, what color it is, etc. Basically, this variable stores all of the information about this current div. So we could access that information by doing div1 dot and then whatever. So we could do like style if we wanted to access or change the styles. And if we wanted to get the value, we could do div1 dot value. I mean, there's no actual value to that div yet, but you get the picture. So we don't have to just fetch divs, by the way. I know we've been working a lot with divs. We can fetch any element we want. For example, if I change this to a paragraph, that works just fine as well. In this case, I would still have my ID being the same, except that div1 is now actually a paragraph, like this, okay? We don't have to actually call the variables, that's Dave, we want div. We don't have to call the variables div or paragraph or anything. We can actually call these variables whatever we want. Usually it's a good idea to make the variable name significant, so it will, represent what this is actually containing. In this case, it is containing a div, so it makes sense to call it div1. So just to keep everything, making sense, I'm just going to change that back to a div there. Alright, so that's really all we wanted to demonstrate to start out with. Keep in mind that this ID has to match this ID exactly. We can use the double or the single quotes it doesn't matter, just make sure you're using two of one kind. So if you're using the double quotes, finish off with double quotes, and single quotes, same thing. And if there is no element with this ID, then it's just not going to return anything. So then be careful not to then try to access div1, okay? Also important to note, we'll see more of this later on, but this is going to return the very first element it finds with this ID, starting from the top and going down. So if we had multiple divs with the same ID, then it's only going to return the first one. And actually, I mean, IDs should be unique anyway, so this shouldn't be a situation that arises in the first place. Okay, so that is actually it for this tutorial. Just wanted to show you how to get an element by its ID. Again, be careful that this isn't capitalized like this. A lot of people make that mistake, in which case the function doesn't work. So in the next tutorial, we'll be discovering a new way to fetch an element that will be by class. So we'll see you guys there. Hello everyone, and welcome to our tutorial on guessing elements by their class name. Here we're going to expand upon what we learned previously, but we're going to be fetching HTML elements by their class instead of their ID. Now there are going to be some subtle differences here, that's why we're doing separate sections. So let's head on over to JSBin now, and we're going to have a similar setup to before. I'm just going to start off with a div, and I'll just put some text in here. Let's just put in Mammoth. It doesn't really matter too much what we put in these divs for now, and there's just a little bit of a margin here, which is why we have the 20 pixels. And the spacing there. So we have two divs here. What we're going to do is, instead of assigning IDs, we'll actually assign a class to these divs. So I'm just going to call this class divs. I mean, that's not a great class name, but in our case it doesn't really matter too much, as we only have these couple of divs we're working with. So both of these belong to the same class, and what we'll try to do here is actually access the class so that we can access all of the divs with that class name. So let's get rid of the CSS for now. So similar to before, there's actually a function document.get elements. This time is elements by class name. So you remember the previous one was get element by ID, and that was returning only one element. This time we're potentially returning lots of elements. So similar to before, we put in the class name that we want. This one's just going to be divs, or whatever class name we assigned here. And so we'll get some result returned. So we can call this divs, and we'll just set it equal to get elements by class name. Now, there's a big difference here in that, well, the obvious difference is that we're doing class name instead of ID, but the bigger difference is that we might return more than one element. In fact, we know we're returning two elements in this case, so it's not like we can then just go divs.style or anything like that. This is actually an array. So the previous variable, when we just did the one div, that was just a single division that we had, a single div or a single paragraph or whatever we're fetching. This time we have an array. So we have our div1 and our div2, kind of like this. We can also think about this as being a list of divs. If there were no elements with that class name, then we'd simply have an empty array. If there was only one element with that class name, we'd still have an array, but there would only be one element in it. And then there's of course the potential to have 3 or 4 or 5 or however many elements match this class here. We could also have multiple types of elements. So for example, let's say I created a paragraph. I'm just going to get rid of that. Let's say I created a paragraph, also of the same class, and this one had some other text. I don't know, maybe it has a full Mammoth Interactive in it. Well, now, guessing all of our elements by their class name is also going to return us this paragraph as well. So basically, we are just returning all of the elements of all types, and we're returning a list of them. So we're just going to say it returns this. Okay, so what can we then do with divs? Well, divs, being an array, gives us a chance to access multiple items. So rather than going divs.style, what we would do is actually get each element. So let's say I wanted to get the div1's style. What I could do is create a variable, maybe I'll call this div1. I'm going to set this equal to divs at the index of 0. So when we deal with arrays in JavaScript or lists, we have to access elements by index. So the first element is index 0, the second element is index 1, index 2, and so on and so forth. So here we're just getting the very first one. If we wanted the second one, we would create a new variable for it. It shouldn't have the same name. We'll do this index 1 if we want the third one, except this one is actually a paragraph, so we'll call this P1. So it's actually going to be divs of 2. But if we try to access a fourth one, so let's say div 3 at the index of 3, well, that index doesn't exist because there are only 3 elements in this list. So the index 3 is out of bounds. Now, JavaScript is kind of annoying in that it doesn't necessarily throw us an error that is easy to detect. It basically just stops working once it reaches this point. That makes it pretty difficult to troubleshoot. So we just have to be, when we're dealing with these arrays, we just have to be very careful not to go out of bounds. We have to make sure that, okay, it says only 3 elements, so I know this index doesn't exist, so this isn't going to work. So I'm just going to make a note saying out of bounds, only 3 elements in this array. Okay. All right, so once you've fetched each of the individual elements, this is a div, this is a div, this is a paragraph. It works just like before, where we could then do, let's say we wanted the style of div1, we could do div1.style. Okay, we could do div1.color, etc. Okay, so in that way we can still access the elements and treat them like we did before. It's just when we call upon this function getElements by class name, it will return us a list or an array of elements. Even if there's only one element within that array, it's still considered an array or a list. Okay, so that's pretty much it for this tutorial. Remember, the big differences between them. This is elements by class name. Otherwise, you still pass in a string that represents the class name and returns possibly multiple elements. The previous one, getElement by ID, was a singular getElement by ID, and that just returns one single element. We access elements in an array based on index, but be sure not to go out of bounds of that index, otherwise your code stops working. Also remember, it goes from top to bottom, so this is going to be the first, second, and third element in our arrays. Okay, so in the next section we're going to look at another way we can access elements, and that will be by tag name. So thanks for watching, we'll see you there. Hello everyone, and welcome to our tutorial on guessing elements by their tag name. Here we're going to learn how to fetch HTML elements by their tag name. This is very similar to the previous section, except instead of class name, we're going by tag name, or essentially what type of HTML element there is. There's some really cool tricks that we can do with this, so let's head on over to JSBin again. We've got a clear HTML code. CSS is the same as before, and we cleared out JavaScript. So what we're going to do is actually just start with a div here. Okay. I'm actually going to give this an ID. This one is going to be something like div1. Okay. And within this div, I'm going to have 2 paragraphs. And we could just have the 1 or 2. In fact, you know what? I'm just going to have the 1 for now, just to demonstrate a point. And we're going to have the second one. So the second one is going to say Mammoth Interactive. And actually, so is the first one. So we have a setup kind of like this. So basically 2 paragraphs, both say Mammoth Interactive or whatever text you'd like. But one of the paragraphs is inside of this div here. Okay, so each of these elements, this div, this paragraph, this body, this head, these are often called tags, HTML tags. Okay, so anything within here is within the head tag. Anything in here is in the body tag. These are all under the paragraph tags. This is a div tag, and so on and so forth. So if we want to access a tag name, basically we put in the name of the tag, and it's a very similar function to get elements by class name. So it's a call to document.get elements, and actually let's just get rid of that. Get elements by tag name. Okay, and here we're just going to put the name of the tag we want. So let's say we wanted all of the paragraphs in a page. So what we could do is we could say all paragraphs is going to be equal to a call to this function. And then we would put in the tag name p because that's the paragraph tag. And now we have access to all of the paragraphs. So this will return an array, just like before, with the paragraph 1 and paragraph 2. So this is paragraph 1, even though it's nested inside of this division because it's top to bottom. And this is going to be paragraph 2 here. So if we wanted the first paragraph, we would do first paragraph is going to be equal to all paragraphs. and we would select the first index, and then we could do the same for the second one. So second paragraph is going to be the all paragraphs index 1. Again, there is no index 2 or 3 or 4, so we would have to be sure to check that. Similarly, if we wanted all the divs, we could do that. If we wanted everything in the body, we could do that. But keep in mind that if we did something like div here, this returns my div and all of its content. So then I could go within that div and get paragraphs. And actually, that's going to be the next thing I want to demonstrate. So far, we're getting all of the paragraphs, so that would be every single paragraph that we could possibly find in this HTML document. If we had a ton of text, that could be dozens and dozens of paragraphs. What if we only wanted this paragraph? Well, we could assign an ID to it, but what if there are actually multiple paragraphs within this? What if we had 2 paragraphs here, and we want both of them? Well, we could do a class name, but then what happens if there's, let's say, a div with that same class name? So we had a div like this, and all 3 of these had the same class name. Then if I use get elements by class name, that's not going to work either, because now I have this annoying div in there. Well, what I could do is get this div, and then just get all the paragraphs within that. So what I'm going to do here is actually say first div is going to be a call to document.get element by ID. I'm going to pass in the ID of div1. So now my first div variable is referencing this div here and everything inside of it. So now what I can do actually is call upon first div, that's fist, we want first div dot get elements by tag name, and I can pass in the tag name of p, and I can store this in a, oops, that should be semicolon. I can store this in a variable called first div paragraphs or something. Paragraphs, there we go. And I'm going to set this equal to this. So this is actually totally allowed. And what this is going to do is, instead of searching through the document and getting all of my paragraphs, so in this case 3 of them, this is actually, and actually, to demonstrate that, I'm going to get rid of that. This is actually now going to search only for paragraphs within first div here. So it's going to ignore this one. It's going to go in first div and say, okay, are there any paragraphs? Yep, there's one here. So we're going to return that. So now my first paragraphs, or first div paragraphs, is actually just going to be paragraph 1 here. All right, so we can basically nest things as deep as we want. If we had divs within divs within divs, and one of those divs had a paragraph, we could search, all 3 layers deep and then get the paragraph there. There's really no limit as to how deep we can go with this. Okay, so this just provides a nicer way for us to select the specific paragraphs and elements that we want, whereas calling upon document.getElements by tag name will get all of the paragraphs or all of the divs or whatever we put in here within that document. So the same logic actually applies to the class names and IDs. We can just get an element and then call upon getElements by class name or get an element by ID on that particular element here, but it's a little less common because, IDs are going to be unique throughout the entire document anyway, so there shouldn't be multiple instances, and generally speaking, you shouldn't really put a bunch of classes in, say, this div, and then a bunch of the same classes in another div. That's not usually very good practice. Okay, so that is actually it for now. There are a couple of other ways to get elements by various other means. We may explore 1 or 2 of them down the line, but this is all you really need to know for now. So we've seen how to get them by ID, by class name, and by tag name, and so we can move on to actually doing something with these variables that we've retrieved. All right, so thanks for watching. We'll see you guys in the next tutorial.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching this course. If you want to watch the rest of the course, the link is down below. Not only will you get the access to this course, but you'll get access to a lot of other courses in a huge bundle, and it's on sale today. So buy it before the sale ends. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in another video.